Welcome to Photography Week 6, the last week before your summative project, your final project. This week, I'd like to talk about two things: visual voice and editing. So, what is visual voice? Visual voice is essentially your photographic identity, and it combines two things. It combines your photographic philosophy, basically some of your big ideas, with your visual style, what your photographs look like. And the combination of those two things um, is what I like to call visual voice. So when we talk about philosophy, I'd like you to start thinking through this week, like, what is your visual voice? So some questions to ask yourself when it has to do with philosophy is, what are the things that you're passionate about showing people? What do you see in this world that you love and you want to show to other people? And then, is there anything specific you'd like to communicate to other people? So, do you like highlighting the beauty of God's creation? Do you see injustice in the world and you want to show it so that it can be fixed? Do you like telling stories? Do you like showing emotions? What do you want to communicate? And then it can also be good to ask yourself, just what are you good at showing or photographing? What are the things that have shown up in your pictures so far? And what are those big ideas that are already coming through in your photographs? So think through some of these like big ideas with your photography. But then also, visual voice has to do with your visual style. A lot of times when people talk about photographers, they just talk about their style. But I think it does us a disservice not to think about some of those bigger ideas along with our style. But what consists of your style? So your style can consist of like the genre you have and the subject matter, but you can also make it more personal too, with what perspective do you take? Is there a composition style that you consistently use in your photographs? Is there a certain lighting style that you consistently use? Is there a certain editing style that you consistently use? And ultimately, as you think through your style, hopefully your style fits with your philosophy so that the style choices that you make with perspective and lighting and editing underscore the things that you're trying to show with your philosophy and your big ideas. So, for example, if you really wanted to show like humorous, bright, cheerful photos, editing them to be black and white might not be your best choice. So things like that. In design, we call this the goodness of fit or design unity. Um, so think through how does your style fit with your philosophy? And again, with style, kind of think through like, how have you been photographing things? Is there a consistent perspective or composition that you've been using? Is there a lighting that you like to use? Is there an editing style that you like to use? So all of these things combined together come together to create your visual voice. So let's look at, what does that look like with some of the photographers we've been looking at previously in this class. So this is John Keatley. Again, he does these portraits. So when I talk about his visual voice, ultimately, basically, he takes photographs of people. So that's the base level. But most of his photographs have some sort of understated humor or some understated emotion to them. But most often it's humor. And he does this through some exaggerated expressions, um, and also some exaggerated sets and poses. But he kind of makes it understated because he desaturates his colors a little bit and increases contrast. Um, so so you're not quite hit over the head with like, oh, this is going to be a funny thing. It's a little bit more subtle through his use of color and contrast. Annie Leibovitz also takes portraits and photos of celebrity, but instead of it being humorous or understated, it's almost overstated in the glamour and the glitz and the drama. If you remember, she did that photo of Queen Elizabeth. And she does this through exaggerated settings and exaggerated poses. Uh, So having a swan draped around Leonardo DiCaprio's neck kind of makes the whole thing feel just above and beyond what you would see in a normal photo or a normal portrait. Another portrait photographer we looked at was Steve McCurry, who does travel and cultural portraits. And his visual style often uses intense colors and color complements. Um, he finds setting and finds lighting, but it's usually pretty soft, good lighting with a simple background, a simple, colorful background. And then he's really good at nailing that direct gaze of the person looking straight at the photo. We looked at Dave Black, who takes pictures of sports and athletes. And he sort of, in his setups, creates a lot of drama in these photos. So he uses studio lighting, he creates interesting settings, but then he also really increases his saturation and contrast so that you get that really high sense of drama in the action. Another thing he does is he always freezes motion, so you get that sense of defying gravity as well. Tanaka Tatsuya, or Miniature Calendar, he does tiny diorama setups using everyday objects. And again, there's that sense of kind of quirky humor, but it's a little more lighthearted than John Keatley. And you can tell because he often has brighter colors, brighter lighting scenarios. And he also makes use of those small depth of field settings to really highlight and emphasize kind of how small things are, so that you just get into the smallness and the quirkiness of it. And we also looked at Ansel Adams, who is a landscape photographer and really is trying to capture the grandeur of nature. So he often does cloudy days, weather, but also with some sun peeking through. He does vast landscapes. He does black and white photography, partly because that's what was available when he was taking photographs, but also it really shows the texture of the clouds and the texture of the mountains and everything really nicely. So you capture that sense of grandeur through his photos. So when I'm talking about visual voice, essentially those are the things I'm talking about. What's the genre? What are some of the big ideas with the genre? So Ansel Adams could be a nature photographer, but get in really close and look at the details as opposed to step back and take the vast landscape. So that's one of the things that makes him unique. And then how his perspective, his editing, his lighting, all of that contributes to his visual voice. The other thing that I want to talk about this week is editing. Editing is very exciting. Editing is a chance to make your good photos that you've been taking for the past 5 weeks and make them even a little bit better. A couple disclaimers with editing. You can't make a bad photo a good photo. If it is blurry or fuzzy or the focus is off, those are things you can't fix with editing. Also, when you're editing, you want to be careful that you don't over edit your photos or make a completely new piece of art. The goal with editing is to make your good photo just that much better, give it a little bit of a boost. So when you're working with sliders, we're going to talk about kind of nudging in one direction or the other instead of going all the way up or all the way down. So what options do you have for editing? More than likely, your phone and your computer have options for doing some edits. I'm going to show you the Photos app on Mac today. Google Photos, where we've been putting our photos for the class, has some editing options. If you want more editing options, a really good free option is Pixlr.com. You do it through your web browser. And they have one option that's a little bit more user-friendly. That's the X option, or the E option, which is the closest free thing. It comes close to Photoshop. So Pixlr, I'll show you a little bit about Pixlr.com. If you are familiar and have access to Photoshop or Lightroom, they are obviously the best options, but they take a lot of learning, and we can do some good editing even without them. So if you want to use Photoshop and Lightroom, please do. But we're not going to look at those today because those just take a lot longer to teach. Okay, so I'm first going to go into the Mac Photos app. And here's the photo that I'm going to work with. I'm going to show it to you, the same photo. We're going to talk about editing. But I'm just going to show you how to do the different edits that the book talks about. So if you want to edit your photo, you click the Edit button. And the first thing to be aware of is up here are the adjustment options, the cropping option, and the filters option. I want you to avoid filters. Filters are basically just preset edits. I want you to learn how to adjust the different things to create the edit that you need for each unique photo, as opposed to using a preset filter, which doesn't always work with every single photo. Sometimes they are nice, I will say that. But for this class, I want you to practice. You're essentially creating your own filter for each photo. It's a good idea to start with cropping. So if you have a horizon line that is at an angle, so mine wasn't at an angle, but if that sea level was at an angle, I would want to adjust the angle of the photo to make sure that my horizon line is straight. And then here's where I can crop if I want to crop for impact. A couple things to be aware of. So with cropping, over here I get some aspect ratios. So I can crop to the original photo, which is usually a good size. With photography, it's good to keep standard aspect ratios intact. So standard is, original is usually 4:3, so you can see, yep, if I click the 4:3, it's the same. You can also do 16:9, which is widescreen, but that only really matters if you're planning on looking at it on, like, vertical is for a phone, horizontal would be for a like a TV or something like that. And then there's the square option if you're doing Instagram. So clicking on those options, it constrains. You see with the square option, I can't make a rectangle, but what I can do is I can kind of zoom in and see, okay, is this a better photo? Do I think yes? Do I think no? And then I can hit reset if I don't like any of those crops. So cropping can be really great. I'm just going to keep this original and I'm just going to crop in just a touch. And then let's go to adjustment. So one of the things you might just see, if I click light, I get this slider where essentially it's the computer deciding what it wants to do. Better option is down here for you to adjust each of these sliders. So brilliance kind of makes it brighter a little bit. Exposure really affects the brightness. Highlights affect just the bright areas of the photo. Shadows affect just the dark areas of the photo. Brightness is similar to exposure, but it works just a little bit differently. Contrast increase the contrast of the photo. So I'm just going to keep that brilliance up there a little bit. So these are all the light sliders. If you have the option, I actually really like working with levels down here. And I'm not going to go into the color ones, but what I can do is I can adjust the mid-tones a bit. So I could make the mid-tones just a little bit lighter and the shadows just a little bit darker. So instead of making those brights too bright, you can kind of control each one just a little bit more. And again, I want to make small changes, not giant changes. But already it's kind of looking just a little bit more poppy. So levels can actually give you a little bit more control over your photo, which is really nice. And then you also might look at color. So if I boost the saturation, the colors just get a little bit brighter. If I take the saturation away, the colors get a little bit duller. And you'll notice, so when we talked about John Keatley, he actually does dull his photos, but most people like a little bit of a saturation boost. If you go too far, you start blowing out those colors. It just starts getting unrealistic. This is too much. So again, you want to kind of give it just a little boost and then that'll kind of get you what you want. There's a black and white option here, but I'm going to hit that undo button. I don't want black and white on this photo. There's a retouch option. The retouch brush, or sometimes called the healing tool brush, looks like this band-aid. And I click on the brush. Let's say I want to get rid of this white spot. All I have to do is make the size of the brush just a little bit bigger than that spot, so that it's basically taking information from the surrounding area and it's filling in. So if I click that, boom, gone. When I go back, that spot isn't there. So if you have dust spots, if you have small sunspots, if you have pimples on a person's face, that brush can all just kind of take those away really nicely. There's also the red eye. Similarly, you need to click on the brush and adjust the size. We can adjust white balance, which is really nice. So if my photo is too blue, I can adjust some yellow. If my photo is too yellow, I can push some blue in there. But this is a pretty good white balance. I might push it just a little bit more blue because I like how that looks. Don't worry about curves unless you've dealt with curves before. They're a little bit more complicated. And two things. So Jim Miyake talks about sharpening your image. This is where you can kind of boost the sharpeningness. Again, you want to avoid over sharpening because that'll actually create some noise and reduce the quality of your photograph. And then here, if you have noise, you can apply a noise reduction filter, but I don't have a lot of noise in this photograph. We can kind of see if I get in close. It's not doing a whole lot because there's not a whole lot of noise. But if you have a photo that you really like but has some noise, the noise reduction filters work okay. It won't reduce a lot of noise, but it'll take some noise away, and that's nice. So those are all your options with the Mac Photos editing tool. Let's look at what Google Photos has. So I'm going to revert to original on this. And we're going to go here. So let's go to Google Photos. So here's my photo, same photo in Google Photos. And up here, I've got some options. And this little slider is the editing option. So just like Mac, the Mac Photos option, I have cropping, and then there were filters, and then there were adjustments. So with cropping, similarly, I can adjust the angle. I can crop in. If I click up here, this is where I get my aspect ratios. So again, clicking original square or 16:9 or 4:3 are your best options. Don't do the freeform one. And if you need to totally rotate your picture, that's this button right here. So we're going to be done with cropping. This first option are filters. Again, let's avoid filters, but let's go into the sliders. So this just gives me light, color, and pop, which I can make lighter, darker, make the color more, less, or just see what pop is sort of an auto feature. But if I click these down arrows, that's where I get some of these options. Now what I don't have here, I do have exposure, contrast, I can adjust highlights and shadows, I can adjust saturation, and so the warmth, that's your white balance option, which is nice. And there's some like skin tone, other color sliders here that can be fun to play with. I don't have the healing brush tool here, I don't have the red eye reduction tool. I don't have the levels option or the sharpening or the noise reduction option here. But the reality is most photos, if you do just a little bit of a contrast boost, a little bit of a saturation boost, make sure your white balance is okay. Pop will probably increase the sharpening just a little bit. You're going to get a good edit to your photo. So that's Google Photos. It's a little bit simpler than Mac. And for something a little more complicated, this is Pixlr.com. This is the X editor. Again, the E editor is closer to Photoshop if you've ever played with Photoshop. But we're just going to look at this one. So over here on the other side, are some of your options. There's the cropping option. So this is where I get the angle, adjusting the angle. I can select the aspect ratio here. So here are the presets. I'm going to do original, but you can also dial in your presets, which is a little bit nicer, and then move. Again, you can kind of move that crop around to make it the photo that you want it to do. And then when you like the crop, you hit enter, and there it is. Okay, so down here, here are some things that have to do with a little bit more Photoshop options. We're not worried about those. So adjustment options are over here. You've got black and white. You can just click it. Invert. I believe Miyake did talk about inverting photos. I find it weird. If you want to play around with that, great. Again, for this class, I think what we're trying to do is use editing to make your photo look like a better photo, not look like a completely different piece of art. So I'm not going to do that. You've got color. I really like the vibrance slider because it makes your colors boost, but it's not as extreme as increasing the saturation, which has a tendency to look unnatural. So vibrance deals a little bit more with light. You've got temperature. Again, that's your white balance. And you can even change the hue, but that's kind of weird. So I'm going to bring that back to the center, to the original. And if you can't dial it in, you can always hit 0 and that'll bring it perfectly center. Under that is light. So you get brightness, exposure, contrast, black, whites. So we've covered all of these before. You can do curves down here. Curves are a little bit tricky. Toning, fill, these are a little bit extra that we're not worried about. So mostly the light and the color, and then if you want, black and white. You can also hit autofix and just see what it does. But sometimes that works well, sometimes it doesn't. Here are some filters. Let's see, mostly I want you to avoid filters. This is where you can sharpen or smooth, or here's the grain to get rid of grain. So I don't recommend trying to use blur. There are some tools where you can kind of paint in a blur afterwards. It usually looks pretty bad because you can't get your edges right. So unless you're familiar with masking in Photoshop, don't try to add a blur later on. It usually looks a little awkward. But so some of these filters down here don't worry about, but sharpening, clarity, and grain can really help you out. Effects, we're not worried about effects. So retouching is where we're going to find, here's that healing brush tool. So if you want to get rid of that, you can use that healing brush tool. So this is where the blur tool is, don't use that. And then here are some extra like design tools that we're not as worried about. But that is pixlr.com. So we're going to get out of this and come back to the slideshow. So this week's ALA is a combination of visual voice and editing. I want you to start by thinking through your own visual voice and basically just ask yourself, what kind of photograph do you want to take? And I want you to set yourself 2 different visual voice challenges. So maybe you're 100% sure that you want to take portraits. Try doing 2 very different kinds of portraits. If you're not sure, maybe you're like, well, I like flowers and I like portraits. Try doing one challenge that's a flower photo, one challenge that's a portrait photo. And try to think through creating your own visual style through these photos. So this is a very open assignment. You get to take what you want to take. And then what I want you to do is pick your best photo from each challenge and edit it to make it better. And then you're going to post it on Google. For your description on Google Photos, what I'd like you to do is describe what the challenge was, what were you trying to do, and then also describe in detail what edits did you make to this photo in order to make it better. This week's inspiration comes from you. So for your discussion and your reading this week, I want you to research a photographer that you find inspiring. So I've got a list of places where you can find a photographer, but if you know who you want to research, great, go for it. Ideally, it's someone who is a professional photographer, and ideally, it's someone who has an artist statement or has done an interview so that you can kind of pull from their big idea thoughts. There are some great wedding photographers out there, but it's maybe harder to find some of their big ideas about photography. And I'd love to kind of incorporate that into your research. And then you're going to post it in the discussion session section. And that's where we'll get to see some inspiration for this week coming from you. So have fun photographing, have fun researching your photographer, and I look forward to seeing your photos.